The Four Nations break is approaching, and the NHL has been very active in trades, despite being almost a month away from the NHL trade deadline. I'm joined today by Cam Lewis, managing editor of Oilers Nation, and we're going to take you around the Oilers and kind of what trade ideas could be a possibility for them. The big one that everyone has spoke about, Cam, especially after the Oilers lost to the Toronto Maple Leafs, is goaltending. I think on the majority of shows we have at Oilers Nation, many would say that it's a difficult position to upgrade for the Oilers, and now many will scream from the rooftops and say it should be the number one priority. I guess, firstly, what is your take on the Oilers goaltending situation currently?
This is a kind of a tough one to talk about because, I mean, the goaltending duo of Stuart Skinner and Calvin Pickard has been just okay. I think it's left a good amount to be desired. They were pretty cold at the start of the season, and I think both goaltenders have kind of come along as time's gone on, but there aren't a tremendous amount of instances where you look at the Oilers and you think, oh wow, their goalie stole them the game. It's more just the goalie was good enough for them to win, and I think more often we see the other team's goalie stealing a win from the Oilers based on how they played, and fans look at that and that's what they want. And then also think back to 2005-06 when the Oilers made their run to the Stanley Cup final, the surprising one. A lot of that was predicated around them acquiring Dwayne Rolison from the Minnesota Wild. He was one of the team's MVPs down the stretch in the playoffs, and had he not have been injured in game one, maybe they win the Stanley Cup. So I think a lot of Oilers fans, just based on history, are kind of by default thinking, okay, we have UC Markin and Ty Conklin as our duo right now, and we need to find our Rolison. I don't know if there's a Rolison out there right now.
Yeah, and I think, too, when you look back at the history of trades with a goaltender in the NHL, there's very few that happen at the deadline that have such a big impact on the teams running the playoffs. And I think when you look back, you'll notice Rolison's probably the last one to really have it. Like, we've seen Ryan Miller get moved, obviously, Jonas Korpisalo a few years ago to LA as well, and Ben Bishop is another notable name of goaltenders that have been moved around the trade deadline. But say the Oilers were to consider going out and doing this and getting another goaltender. And I don't think people are pushing Skinner out by any means. I think they're just looking for him to have a bit more support than Calvin Pickard, who I think it's also fair to say has played above what he was expected to as well. But is there someone out there that you would consider an upgrade that the Oilers should maybe slightly consider? Like, if you look at Frank's list, it was only Dan Vladar was the only goaltender on the list, and he's certainly not an option.
Yeah, that's not obviously going to be an upgrade. So what I did is I looked at, on Hockey Reference, the top goalies sorted by goals saved above average, which people say is more of an individual stat than goals against or save percentage, more team stats. This stat shows how goalies are doing against tough shots, things like that. And you look up and down this list, Stuart Skinner and Cal Pickard, for reference, are ranked 40th and 44th in the NHL in this. So they're just kind of middling goalies, which is what the eye test would say. But you look at the top names here in goals saved above average, you got names like Connor Hellebuck, Logan Thompson, Mackenzie Blackwood, Andrei Vasilevsky. All these guys are either signed long-term already or they've just signed multi-year contracts. So among these top 20 names, the only two that I landed on that I could find that actually made sense to be traded before this year's trade deadline are John Gibson of the Anaheim Ducks and Karl Vejmelka of the Utah Hockey Club. Yeah. And I mean, Gibson used to be the Vezina caliber goalie. We all know him. He beat the Oilers in the playoffs in 2017, and he's got 1 year left in his contract at $6.4 million. So expensive, but solid goalie in the past. And then Vejmelka has 1 year left at $2.725 million. So more acquirable for the Oilers based on their salary cap picture, but he has no playoff experience. So the trouble for Edmonton is that Stuart Skinner and Cal Pickard, if you look at goalie duos in the NHL, there aren't very many that are cheaper than that. Those two make $3.6 million annually. And if the Oilers want to add a guy like Gibson who has playoff experience, and I mean, that's even a risk because he's not as good as he used to be. But if they want to do that, then there's probably a contract going out the other way as well.
And I think, too, it's fair to say the Oilers probably have a couple of other areas they would like to upgrade before they prioritize what a goaltender could do for this team as well. And that kind of moves on to the next part that we want to talk about is defensemen that are available. Now, on Frank Saravalli's trade list, there was 4 right shot defensemen. We all see the obvious hole on the right side. They've brought in John Klingberg. Can't really give a good idea of what he is. He's only played 3 games, so still needs a lot more. Leaves some to be desired, but there's 4 players on the list that are right shots from Frank. Rasmus Ristolainen, who's $5.1 million, 2 years left after this one. Seth Jones, who just seems like not even an option. It's kind of pointless saying his name. $9.5 million, 5 more years left. Connor Murphy, probably the most realistic, $4.5 million, 1 year left after this one. And David Savard, who a few years ago would have been a solid option, $3.4 million, pending UFA. Out of those four names, and maybe if there's some other ones too on Frank's list, is there a defenseman there that you would like the Oilers to pursue more than others?
There definitely doesn't seem to be like a Matthias Ekholm style addition this year. Like, remember a few years ago when the Oilers made that trade with the Nashville Predators, there wasn't much rumbling about Ekholm specifically, but he was on Frank's board. He was the highlight player on one of these articles saying Matthias Ekholm's available from the Predators. Nobody in Edmonton was talking about this as being the inevitable move or anything. So it sort of came out of the blue, but it also didn't. Like, there was still somewhat of an expectation the Preds could look to move on from that player at that time, whereas you look around now and there really isn't a top pairing option out there on the market. I think of those four names, two of them are ones I'd scratch off right away. Seth Jones, his contract, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot full. And David Savard, I have a hard time imagining at this stage of his career he's an upgrade even on Troy Stetcher and Ty Emberson for the third pairing.
Skating's such a liability. Yeah, he's a good defensive-minded guy, but the other defensemen need to be able to skate.
Yeah, exactly. And you need someone who can comfortably play second pairing minutes, because that's what they're trying to replace is still Philip Broberg ultimately from the conference finals and the Stanley Cup final when he played so effectively next to Darnell Nurse. He, of course, signs the contract with St. Louis in the offseason. The Oilers also moved Cody Ceci. I think Ty Emberson's replaced Ceci nicely, but the jury is still out as to whether Klingberg can replace Broberg. So I think if you're the Oilers, I wouldn't lock myself into worrying about specifically a right-handed D-man. They might just be better off looking for D-men in general and then shuffling things around. Who fits best on their offside? The name that sticks out to me is one that Tyler Yaremchuk mentioned in an article for the website, and that's Jamie Alexiak from the Seattle Kraken. He's a 6'7" defender with a long reach. He skates pretty well. He's a low-maintenance player. He isn't somebody who makes risky plays. I think he'd be nice next to either Darnell Nurse or Evan Bouchard, who are two players who having strong seasons, but I think they're both prone to some boneheaded plays occasionally. So having a conservative D-man like Alexiak next to them would be helpful.
Yeah, $4.6 million next season as well for Jamie Alexiak, 32 years old. Funnily enough, he's been traded twice in his career. He's traded from Dallas to Pittsburgh for a 4th-round pick, and then from Pittsburgh to Dallas for a 4th-round pick. I'd love to see another player that
for a 4th-round pick. I'd be thrilled if that's what he cost again.
I'd be all in. We had Frank Saravalli on Oilers Nation every day as well, and he did mention that if the Oilers were to, Connor Murphy was kind of a name he brought up to him, and Alexiak seemed to be the 1-2 that he had, was if the Oilers were to go out and spend a 1st-round asset on acquiring either of those guys, they would also look to add maybe a depth piece as well from either of those teams. Obviously, they were linked to Drew O'Connor before he was traded to the Pittsburgh Penguins as well. Frank said they're just looking to add a bit more speed to the lineup, which brings us to our third and final point. This is an interesting one. I don't see this as a legit option for the Oilers because once I say the name, everyone's going to be like, why would they let him go? He's such a legend in that city. But there was talks yesterday of Brad Marchand potentially being available in Boston. Now, he is obviously not the elite player he once was, but has been able to maintain like a pretty high standard throughout his career. 36 years old, obviously going to the Four Nations with Canada as well. He has 19 goals, 23 assists for 42 points on the season in 55. The first question, do you think this is actually a fit for the Oilers if this was to become real at some point?
I think it's a fit for the Oilers, but I mean, it's hard to say. I don't think there's many teams out there that are Stanley Cup contenders or even middling playoff contenders that would say Brad Marchand's not a fit on our team. He's somebody who's notoriously played well in big game situations. He, of course, won the Stanley Cup in 2011, 2 more trips to the Stanley Cup final, I believe, in 2013 and 2019 were the 2 years that Boston reached the Cup final. So big game player. I mean, would be a huge pest for the Oilers. Totally. Like, imagine a team with Edmonton's power play having a guy like Brad Marchand on their team. We all know that Connor McDavid, for some reason, can't draw any penalties. That's been a big talking point already in 2025, as it's been for years. But you have a guy like Brad Marchand, who's a real legitimate pest, who might be able to put the Oilers in the power play a lot. And then also, this has been noticeable the past few games as well, but the Oilers are kind of sinking back into a position they were a few years ago when if Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl aren't creating offense, it feels like nobody is.
Yes.
And I'm not going to say that guys like Nugent-Hopkins and Henrique and the depth players on the Oilers are never going to score again, but they have a lot of guys that are pretty cold right now. And you have to wonder if, I mean, we came into the season thinking upgrade the D, but it might just be find the biggest game-changing winger, center, forward that you can find.
Yeah, and for me, what you just kind of said there at the end, find the game breakers further up the ice, and that's why goaltending is probably lower down on the list for me, considering the needs they need to address in other positions too. But if Boston was to sell, they're currently tied for a playoff spot in the Eastern Conference with 60 points, but they do have 2 games in hand over the final wild card spot. Would Brad Marchand be the number 1 player you would pursue on the Bruins if they decided to open up?
Yeah, I think so. And I think maybe the other one that I would look at that makes some amount of sense, and I'm not sure if the Bruins would do this because he's quite a bit younger, is the D-man Brandon Carlo.
Great player.
Another one who's would be good for the similar reasons that Jamie Oleksiak seems good for the Oilers. Just a guy with a long reach, a guy who's fairly conservative. You can trust him in your own zone, staple him next to a Bouchard or a Nurse, maybe something like that might be helpful. But I mean, you'd obviously want to get David Pasternak from the Bruins, but there's just no way that's going to happen. So if you want to add an impact forward from a middling team that might sell and Brad Marchand becomes available, I think that's something the Oilers should definitely explore, because just finding a way before the trade deadline, regardless of position, to add someone that can be a game changer, no matter whether they're left or right-handed, forward or D, just I think maybe for the Oilers right now, it's go out and find the best player available that you can realistically add. And maybe a 36, 37-year-old Brad Marchand, pending UFA. Yeah. He can come back to Boston in the offseason. The Bruins get an asset or two, something like that to help them retool a little bit. Maybe it makes sense. Yeah,
it's not that crazy to think about when you put everything together, but it's an interesting one. Brandon Carlo this season, you mentioned him, +3 on the season. I say that because he's a +130 in his career of 608 games. For a defenseman that doesn't put up a ton of points, 9 this season, 54, 14 last season in 76 games, he's quite an impressive player.
Doing something right.
Yeah, for sure. Like consistent there. On Frank's list, it was 2 Boston Bruins on his list, Trent Frederick at 18 and Justin Brazeau at 21. But we'll see what happens. The Oilers are heading into Colorado. What is it tonight? Chicago, Colorado Friday. Then they're going into their 4 Nations break. So we'll see if they get anything moving before then. But I don't see it as being a strong possibility. And I think no, wait till the trade deadline or at least closer. But we'll be back with some more trade rumors next week.
What's up, Nation citizens? If you like that video, then you need to be subscribed to the Oilers Nation YouTube. Podcasts, live shows, exclusive interviews, and analysis. Everything you need from your favorite voices at Oilers Nation. And you don't want to miss any of it, so hammer that subscribe button.